One concern is that there is an emphasis in both the letter that Science published and the blog post that the editor who made the decision apparently posted about it, which is there's an emphasis on the hazard that the lab leak hypothesis might pose to people of Asian descent. In other words, there's an emphasis on that concern, which I think, frankly, is not impossible that there would be such a thing. But I wonder if this is not an indication of how this was rationalized on the inside, that in effect, people who knew better were saying less than they understood because they were attempting to protect colleagues and others who might legitimately fear a backlash.
I guess that's possible. I don't see this as emphasized in the letter. There is, the very last, very short paragraph of a admittedly short letter mentions that this should be in no way an excuse to further anti-Asian sentiment, which should be obvious to every reasonable human being. But I don't know that qualifies as an emphasis, but perhaps. Well,
it does in such a short letter. It does when it shows up also in the blog commentary on the letter. And then there is the fact of what the New York Times, Still,
but I guess I would say that the scientists, the 18 scientists who wrote the letter, have no control at all over the blog commentary on their research, right? Like we have to be very careful about ascribing any intention to the people writing the letter for, what goes on downstream, because that's part of what we've been talking about, right? For over 14 months now is like, to the degree that scientists are trying to get the word out, the media, there seems to be some concerted effort that may or may not be coordinated on the part of media, on the part of tech companies, on the part of academia, on the part of the WHO, various places to stop discussion. And so what happens on a separately written post about a letter, the authors of the original letter cannot be held responsible.
No, I'm not holding them responsible. But what I'm saying is I think given what in a very short pivot is included and then mentioned again in a commentary on the pivot, I'm wondering if this is not an indication of the internal. Something allowed lots of people who should have known better to say things that didn't make any sense for more than a year. So what is it that they were saying to themselves is a question that is very important if we're to ever face such a thing again and prevent it from happening, right? So what was the internal excuse? That's a good question. And this may or may not be it, or it may or may not be part of it. But the other thing is,
well, I mean, that's actually, it's huge if that is the case. And I wouldn't put the possibility of that very high myself. But what that suggests is that fear of racism has created an anti-scientific movement that has clouded the waters effectively for an entire year, during which the world has been in unprecedented territories across every domain. Right. And, to which then I will point my finger at, yes, there are some actual racists out there who are assholes and need to stop it. Right. But what we have for almost exactly that same time period, and of course starting well before that, is a focus on how racist everyone is, right? This talk about how everyone has to admit their own racism, no doubt encourages the sense that what we really need to do, one of the priorities we need to engage in, is making sure that no racism ever happens. And we do need to make sure of that. But if there is basically a false boogeyman wherein racism is misunderstood to be far more widespread than it actually is, which we have talked about extensively on this podcast, we understand that to be the case, then if that is partially to blame for this misdirect, this terrible policy and apparent scientific backing of bad policy to not engage what was obviously a possible hypothesis from the beginning, then that's one more thing on the list of harms that critical race theory and intersectionality and wokeism have brought to the world, frankly.
Agreed. Now, the question, though, is how does it fit with respect to a pivot that has another frightening feature to it? Mm-hmm. Okay, so on the one hand, you've got this emphasis on preventing a backlash against Asians, which, of course, makes sense, but
certainly, if this did come from the WIV, it wasn't the Chinese people.
Well, but
right?
that's been my point, which is, in fact, those of us who have been pushing for a responsible investigation of the lab leak have been saying this isn't a Chinese failure. This is a failure of the international scientific community, if that's where this came from.
Yes.
So we've been careful about that. And to now have a sort of, well, we need to investigate this, but when it's like, well, actually, we were ahead on that too, right? Not the Chinese. This is not a Chinese failure. Now, it may well, the cover-up is a failure of the Chinese Communist Party and the government of China, but that's not the same thing as the responsibility of Asians, right?
Of course not. And, as you began this commentary by saying the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the Barrick Lab in North Carolina are actually by many measures, the two most premier labs in the world doing exactly the kind of gain of function research that would have allowed such a virus potentially to be created, such that, this kind of research needs to be, regardless of whether or not this particular virus emerged from a lab, that this type of research needs to be reassessed, as it was, as I don't remember the dates, but we've talked about it before. It was halted, I think, something like 2014 under the Obama administration, and reinstated in 2018, I think.
With the help of Dr. Fauci.
Yes, during the Trump administration, but with the help of Dr. Fauci, this type of research was reinstated.
Yep. And, getting to the bottom of this is central because either this thing jumped from nature and the people who were screaming that we needed to do gain of function research in order to get ahead of the next pandemic, have been vindicated themselves in a sense, right? I don't think gain of function research is sensible, but if this pandemic really leapt from nature without going through a lab, then it tells one story. And if it came from the lab, it tells the opposite story, that it was exactly the panicked response to the possibility of something jumping from nature that caused us to put ourselves in such a serious situation. So I just want to go to the last thing on this is the New York Times article in which it attempts to contextualize this letter in science. Right. So, Zach, you have that letter. Can you put it? That article. So the New York Times basically does a report on the letter that includes Barrick. And unfortunately, I can't read it at that size. But in any case, it does a number of things. And effectively, it reads like it's Carl Zimmer is one of the authors. It reads as an attempt to reposition the elite so that they don't lose all credibility, having been on the wrong side of this issue for so long with so much at stake. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things it does, can you scroll down a little bit more? So first of all, it embarrassingly conflates theory and hypothesis, again, for no particularly good reason. Okay. Well, I'm not going to be able to find it with Zach scrolling, but what it says in the center of this article is that the problem in large measure is that those who have been pushing to consider the lab leak hypothesis have been expressing too much certainty, and that the problem is people who have been too certain, right? And it puts it's
our fault.
Yeah, exactly. It's our fault, even though
we haven't been certain.
We haven't been certain at all. In fact, I've been saying,
that's a clever pivot right there.
It's a clever pivot, right? Mm-hmm. And my point has been, stop saying theory. It's not a theory. Right. It's a hypothesis, as is the other. We're not certain. Here are the, when you say it's a hypothesis, you're saying here are the exact rules of engagement.
Well, what's going to come back at you is that you made a flow chart and you said, here and also on Belmar, something like, I think there's a greater than 95% chance.
Well,
and that is read apparently as certainty.
Well, I don't know. I think the point is those who are making this want to make a general explanation of why they were on the wrong side, right? And to portray, basically to strawman anyone who was on the other side, even though I think the strength of those, in the drastic group of Alina Chan, of us, has been that we've been very, very careful to say this isn't certain, but there is an impressive amount of evidence that points in this direction.
It's typical now, right? Like there is no end of attempts to further divide us. And, every kind of argument seems to be, rather than scientific, an us versus them argument. And the us versus them arguments, of course, they sometimes sometimes come cloaked in pseudoscientific rhetoric, as if as if by going forward with that, yummy dopamine hit feeling of, I don't like the people who look like that.
Yeah.
I don't like the people who aren't wearing masks outside. I don't like the people who think that this was a lab leak, as if that has anything to do with a scientific assessment of any of these things. That's a pure, raw, emotional, like amygdala response that is not in any way scientific.
Right. And at some level here, we have the hazard that, as the elites often do when they are unable to control a story, they are going to do everything in their power to not allow the implications of it to be understood. The implications are something is wrong with our institutional structure, that it got this one so very wrong, and that forces us to ask the question, what else might it be getting wrong? So we can leave it at that, but I very much want people to keep an eye on what was actually said and what this pivot is going to do in terms of portraying what was being said.